I'm a cardiac surgeon at Riverside Medical Center in Portland, Oregon, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation last month. You can call me Dr. Isabella Moreau if you want, though most people in the cardiac unit just called me the heart surgeon during my 18 years there. I've seen everything you can imagine in cardiac surgery: valve replacements, bypass procedures, heart transplants, and every kind of damage the human heart can endure. But what I'm about to tell you about happened during my second year of medical school at Stanford University, and it's the one incident that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, and ultimately led me to leave medicine entirely. The case I'm about to describe began long before that terrifying night in October 2001. It started with what should have been a routine anatomy lab session, studying a cadaver that would challenge every scientific principle I had learned about human biology and post-mortem physiology. Stanford University School of Medicine is one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the world, consistently ranked among the top 3 medical schools in the United States. Located in Palo Alto, California, the medical campus serves as both an educational facility and a major research center that attracts some of the brightest minds in medicine from around the globe. During my time there as a second-year medical student, I was known among my peers and professors as someone who approached medicine with unwavering scientific rigor. I didn't believe in coincidences, unexplained phenomena, or anything that couldn't be verified through multiple peer-reviewed studies. My undergraduate degree was in biochemistry from MIT, and I had spent 2 years working in research laboratories before entering medical school. I was the student who questioned everything, demanded evidence for every claim, and approached each case with methodical precision. The Stanford Anatomy Laboratory was located in the basement of the Olway Building, a state-of-the-art facility that housed some of the most advanced medical education resources available anywhere. The anatomy lab itself was a cathedral-like space with vaulted ceilings, pristine white walls, and 24 stainless steel dissection tables arranged in perfect rows. Each table was equipped with professional-grade lighting, magnification systems, and advanced ventilation to manage the chemical preservatives used in the cadaveric specimens. The lab maintained a strict protocol for cadaver acquisition, preparation, and student assignment. Every body donated to the medical school underwent a comprehensive screening process, detailed medical history review, and standardized preservation procedure using a proprietary formalin-based embalming technique that had been refined over decades. Students were assigned to specific cadavers for the entire academic year, working in teams of 4 to systematically explore every aspect of human anatomy. My team's assigned cadaver was a 72-year-old woman who had died of complications from diabetes 6 months before our semester began. According to the detailed medical records provided to us, Evelyn Margaret Thornfield had been a retired librarian from Sacramento who had specifically requested that her body be donated to Stanford Medical School upon her death. Her cause of death was listed as diabetic ketoacidosis, leading to multiple organ failure, and she had died peacefully at UC Davis Medical Center on March 15, 2001. Mrs. Thornfield had undergone the standard preservation process immediately after death. This involved the complete replacement of all bodily fluids with chemical preservatives, including formalin, methanol, and phenol. The embalming process at Stanford was particularly thorough, requiring a minimum of 72 hours for complete fluid replacement and tissue saturation. After preservation, bodies were stored in climate-controlled chambers at precisely 38 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 3 months before being released for educational use. By the time our anatomy class began in September 2001, Mrs. Thornfield's body had been preserved for 6 months. The preservation was excellent. Her tissues maintained proper consistency for dissection. There was no evidence of decomposition, and the chemical saturation was complete throughout all organ systems. Her medical history indicated no unusual conditions that would complicate our anatomical studies. Our dissection team consisted of myself, Marcus Chen from Berkeley, Amanda Rodriguez from UCLA, and David Kim from Harvard. We had been working with Mrs. Thornfield's cadaver for 7 weeks, systematically exploring different body systems according to our curriculum schedule. We had successfully completed dissections of the musculoskeletal system, respiratory system, and were currently focusing on the cardiovascular system. During those 7 weeks, everything had proceeded exactly as expected. The preservation was holding perfectly, our dissections were clean and educational, and Mrs. Thornfield's anatomy was textbook perfect for learning purposes. There had been absolutely no unusual observations, unexpected findings, or anything that deviated from standard cadaveric study protocols. October 23rd, 2001 was a Tuesday evening that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was the night before our midterm practical examination in gross anatomy, one of the most challenging and important exams of our second year. The practical would require us to identify hundreds of anatomical structures, explain physiological relationships, and demonstrate our understanding of human body systems through hands-on examination of our cadavers. I had always been someone who performed better studying alone, particularly when reviewing complex anatomical relationships. While my teammates preferred group study sessions, I found that I could concentrate more effectively in the quiet solitude of the anatomy lab during evening hours. The lab was officially open 24 hours during examination periods, allowing students like me to pursue independent study without the distractions of daytime classes and conversations. That Tuesday evening, I arrived at the anatomy lab at approximately 9:15 p.m. The hallway building was nearly empty, except for security personnel and a few graduate students working late in research laboratories on the upper floors. The anatomy lab itself was completely deserted when I used my student ID card to access the basement level. The lab after hours had an almost sacred quality to it. The overhead lights were dimmed to energy-saving levels, creating dramatic shadows between the dissection tables. The constant hum of the ventilation system provided a steady background sound that was both comforting and slightly eerie. Most of the cadavers were covered with white sheets, creating ghostly silhouettes throughout the room. I made my way to table 12, where Mrs. Thornfield had been our study partner for the past 7 weeks. I turned on the individual table lighting system, adjusted the magnification lens, and carefully removed the protective covering from her upper torso. We had been focusing our recent work on the cardiovascular system, and I wanted to review the coronary arteries, cardiac chambers, and major vessel pathways one final time before the exam. Mrs. Thornfield's chest cavity had been carefully opened during our previous lab sessions. He had removed the sternum and ribs according to proper anatomical technique, exposing the heart, lungs, and major vessels. The heart itself had been partially dissected to reveal the internal chambers, valve structures, and coronary circulation. Our work had been meticulous and thorough, following the exact procedures outlined in our anatomy atlas. I spent approximately 2 hours that evening reviewing everything we had learned. I traced the path of blood flow through the cardiac chambers, identified each coronary artery and its branches, and tested my ability to recognize anatomical landmarks that would likely appear on the practical exam. Everything was exactly as it should be, missive of tissue maintaining proper consistency, clear anatomical relationships, and no signs of deterioration or unexpected changes. At exactly 11:43 I know the precise time because I had been checking my watch regularly, planning to leave the lab by midnight. I noticed something that should not have been possible. As I was reviewing the left anterior descending coronary artery, carefully tracing its path along the surface of the heart, I observed what appeared to be a small droplet of liquid forming at the edge of our previous dissection. My initial assumption was that I had somehow contaminated the specimen with preservative fluid from my gloves or instruments. The lab maintained strict protocols about fluid management, and any contamination would need to be reported and cleaned immediately. I checked my gloves for tears, examined my dissection tools for leaks, and looked around the table for any obvious source of the liquid. But as I looked more closely at the droplet, I realized it was not the brownish, chemical-scented preservative fluid I expected. This liquid was bright red, with the unmistakable color and consistency of fresh human blood. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing through the lens of my scientific training. Preserved cadavers do not produce blood. The embalming process completely replaces all bodily fluids with chemical preservatives. After 6 months of preservation and 7 weeks of dissection work, there should be absolutely no blood remaining anywhere in Mrs. Thornfield's cardiovascular system. But as I watched, the single droplet was joined by others. Small beads of bright red blood began appearing at multiple sites throughout the exposed chest cavity. The cardiac chambers where we had made our careful incisions, the coronary arteries we had dissected to study their branching patterns. Even the pulmonary vessels showed tiny spots of blood beginning to seep through our previous dissection work. Within 10 minutes, what had started as isolated droplets had become a steady, gentle flow of blood from multiple anatomical sites. The blood was collecting in the chest cavity, pooling around the base of the heart, and beginning to overflow onto the stainless steel table surface. I immediately began documenting everything I observed. Using my student notebook, I recorded the exact time, the location of each bleeding site, and the approximate rate of blood flow. I took photographs with my digital camera, making sure to capture both close-up details and wider shots showing the overall extent of the phenomenon. The blood itself was unlike anything I had ever seen in a preserved specimen. It was bright red, indicating high oxygen content. It flowed smoothly, suggesting normal viscosity and cellular composition. Most disturbing of all, it was warm to the touch when I carefully tested it with a sterile thermometer from the lab supplies. By 12:15 a.m., I knew I was witnessing something that required immediate expert consultation. I called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, our gross anatomy professor and lab director. Dr. Hendricks had been teaching anatomy at Stanford for 23 years and was considered one of the leading experts in cadaver preservation and anatomical education in the country. Dr. Hendricks, this is Isabella Moreau, I said, when she answered her phone. I'm sorry to call so late, but I'm in the anatomy lab, and I need you to see something immediately. It's Mrs. Thornfield, our cadaver. She's bleeding. There was a long pause before Dr. Hendricks responded. Isabella, I think you might be confused about what you're seeing. Preserved cadavers don't bleed. Perhaps you're seeing some preservative fluid, or maybe there's been some contamination from another source. No, Dr. Hendricks, I insisted. This is definitely blood, fresh, red blood. It's been flowing for over 30 minutes now, and it's not stopping. I've documented everything, and I need someone with more experience to help me understand what's happening. Dr. Hendricks arrived at the lab within 20 minutes, accompanied by Dr. Stephen Walsh from the pathology department. Both professors approached table 12 with obvious skepticism, expecting to find a confused student who had misidentified some routine lab phenomenon. Their skepticism vanished the moment they saw Mrs. Thornfield. My God, Doctor, Hendricks whispered, staring at the pool of blood that had collected in the chest cavity. In 23 years of teaching anatomy, I have never seen anything like this. Dr. Walsh, whose expertise in forensic pathology had involved thousands of post-mortem examinations, was equally baffled. He began conducting an immediate investigation, checking preservation tags, reviewing medical records, and examining the bleeding sites with professional precision. The preservation documentation is completely normal, he reported after reviewing Mrs. Thornfield's files. Standard embalming procedure, proper chemical saturation, appropriate storage conditions. There is absolutely no medical explanation for active bleeding in a specimen that has been preserved for 6 months. Over the next hour, both professors documented the phenomenon extensively. They collected blood samples in sterile containers, photographed the bleeding sites from multiple angles, and made detailed measurements of blood flow rates and accumulation volumes. They also called in Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the biochemistry department to assist with immediate laboratory analysis of the blood samples. Dr. Martinez arrived with portable testing equipment that allowed for immediate blood analysis without leaving the anatomy lab. The results of her preliminary tests were as impossible as the bleeding itself. "This is definitely human blood," she reported after running the initial assays. "Normal cellular composition, appropriate protein levels, standard electrolyte balance. But here's what doesn't make sense. The blood shows signs of recent oxygenation. The hemoglobin saturation levels are consistent with active circulation, not post-mortem specimens." The bleeding continued at a steady rate throughout our investigation. By 2 a.m., we had collected over 600 milliliters of fresh blood from Mrs. Thornfield's cardiovascular system. The blood was pooling not only in the chest cavity, but also beginning to seep from other dissection sites throughout her body. The abdominal cavity, where we had studied digestive organs, the extremities where we had examined muscle and bone structures, even small incisions we had made weeks earlier, were now producing fresh blood flow. Dr. Hendricks made the decision to call in additional expertise. Within the next hour, we were joined by Dr. Michael Torres from cardiothoracic surgery, Dr. Jennifer Liu from hematology, and Dr. Robert Chang from the university's research division focused on post-mortem biology. Each expert was as confounded as the others. The bleeding was medically impossible, yet it was happening in front of multiple professional witnesses who could not explain what they were observing. The bleeding reached its peak intensity around 3:30 a.m., with blood flowing steadily from dozens of dissection sites throughout Mrs. Thornfield's body. The lab team had set up collection systems to prevent blood from spilling onto the floor, and we were measuring approximately 100 milliliters of blood production every 15 minutes. Most remarkably, the blood maintained its bright red color and a normal consistency throughout the entire event. Laboratory analysis continued to show normal human blood chemistry with no signs of the chemical preservatives that should have replaced all bodily fluids months earlier. At exactly 4:47 a.m., after more than 5 hours of continuous bleeding, the phenomenon stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Within minutes, there was no more active blood flow from any of the dissection sites. Mrs. Thornfield's body appeared to return to its normal preserved state, showing no external signs of the impossible event that 6 medical professionals had witnessed and documented, but the evidence remained. We had collected nearly 1,200 milliliters of fresh human blood from a cadaver that had been dead and preserved for 6 months. The laboratory analysis confirmed that this was normal, oxygenated human blood with no trace of preservative chemicals. We sealed the anatomy lab as a precautionary measure and spent the remainder of the night documenting every detail of what we had witnessed. By 6 a.m., we had created a comprehensive report that included photographs, laboratory results, witness statements, and detailed timelines of the entire event. I left the anatomy lab that morning, knowing that everything I thought I understood about death, preservation, and human physiology had been fundamentally challenged. But what I didn't realize was that this impossible night was only the beginning of discoveries that would haunt me for the next 20 years, and ultimately force me to question whether death is as final and absolute as medical science teaches us to believe. What happened next would shake my faith in medical institutions forever. Within 48 hours of our impossible night in the anatomy lab, I received a call from Dr. Richard Blackwood, the Dean of Stanford Medical School. His message was brief but chilling. "Miss Moreau, please report to my office immediately. We need to discuss the incident in the anatomy lab." When I arrived at Dean Blackwood's office, I found not only him, but also Dr. Margaret Foster from the university's legal department, and Dr. James Morrison, the head of campus security. The atmosphere was tense and formal, unlike any academic meeting I had ever attended. "Isabella," Dean Blackwood began, "we've reviewed the reports from Tuesday night's incident. While we appreciate your detailed documentation, we have concerns about how this information might be interpreted if it becomes public knowledge? I was confused by the direction of the conversation. Sir, shouldn't we be investigating what caused Mrs. Thornfield to bleed? This could represent a significant breakthrough in our understanding of post-mortem physiology. Dr. Foster leaned forward, her expression serious. Miss Moreau, Stanford University has a reputation to maintain. Stories about bleeding cadavers could damage our credibility as a scientific institution and potentially affect our research funding and medical program accreditation. Over the next hour, they presented me with what they called a revised interpretation of the events. According to their version, what we had witnessed was a previously unknown reaction between preservative chemicals and ambient temperature fluctuations in the lab's climate control system. The blood was actually a mixture of preservative fluids and residual biological material that had somehow liquefied and taken on a reddish appearance. But the laboratory analysis confirmed it was actual human blood. I protested. Dr. Martinez tested it extensively. The cellular composition, the oxygenation levels, everything indicated fresh blood, not preservative fluid. Dean Blackwood's response chilled me to the bone. Dr. Martinez has agreed that her initial analysis may have been compromised by equipment malfunction and fatigue. She's prepared a corrected report that supports our findings about chemical reactions in the preservation process. They presented me with a non-disclosure agreement, stating that discussing the alleged supernatural events in the anatomy lab could result in my immediate expulsion from medical school and potential legal action for damaging the university's reputation. I refused to sign the agreement that day, insisting that the truth of what we witnessed needed to be preserved and investigated. But over the following weeks, the pressure intensified dramatically. My grades in anatomy began to suffer inexplicably. Practical exams that I knew I had performed well on came back with failing scores. Dr. Hendricks, who had been present during the bleeding incident, suddenly became distant and formal in her interactions with me. When I tried to discuss what we had witnessed, she would quickly change the subject or claim she didn't remember the details clearly. More disturbing was what happened to the other witnesses. Dr. Walsh, from pathology, was reassigned to a research position at another university. Dr. Martinez took a sudden leave of absence for personal reasons. The other medical experts who had documented the impossible bleeding were either transferred, promoted to administrative positions that removed them from direct patient care, or simply disappeared from the Stanford campus entirely. My teammates, Marcus, Amanda, and David were called into separate meetings with university officials. When they returned, they refused to discuss what had happened in the anatomy lab and claimed they didn't remember anything unusual about that night. The most shocking revelation came when I tried to access Mrs. Thornfield's cadaver for follow-up examination. I was told that the body had been released for burial due to preservation complications just 3 days after the bleeding incident. When I requested access to the documentation and photographs we had taken that night, I was informed that all materials related to the alleged incident had been classified as confidential university property. The final straw came during my third-year surgical rotations. I was assigned to work with Dr. Harrison Webb, a cardiovascular surgeon who had heard about my problems with distinguishing between preserved specimens and living patients. His comments were subtle but constant, designed to undermine my confidence and make me question my own perceptions. During one particularly difficult day in the cardiac surgery unit, Dr. Webb pulled me aside after I had successfully assisted with a complex valve replacement procedure. "Isabella," he said, "you have excellent technical skills and strong analytical abilities, but there are rumors about your reliability when it comes to unusual observations. In surgery, we need team members who can distinguish between reality and imagination. Perhaps you should consider a specialty that doesn't require such precise judgment." That conversation made me realize that the Stanford administration had systematically destroyed my credibility within the medical community. No matter how well I performed clinically, I would always be known as the student who claimed to have seen impossible things in the anatomy lab. I began to understand that questioning the official narrative about Mrs. Thornfield would end my medical career before it had truly begun. The institution was more powerful than any individual student, and they were willing to sacrifice my future to protect their reputation. 6 months after the incident, I was approached by Dr. Sarah Chen, a former Stanford pathology resident who had recently completed her training. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Palo Alto, far from the medical campus. "Isabella," she said quietly, "I heard about what happened to you in the anatomy lab. I wanted you to know that you're not crazy, and you're not the first person this has happened to." Dr. Chen went on to explain that in her 4 years of residency, she had heard whispered stories from other medical students and residents about similar impossible phenomena. Cadavers that showed signs of life, preserved specimens that seemed to respond to stimuli, and post-mortem behaviors that defied medical explanation. "The university has a pattern," she told me. "When these incidents occur, they discredit the witnesses, relocate the evidence, and create official explanations that protect the institution's reputation. They've been doing this for decades." She showed me a collection of incident reports that she had quietly gathered over the years, stories of medical students who witnessed unexplained phenomena during their training, only to be silenced, discredited, or forced to leave their programs. The reports described bleeding cadavers, preserved specimens that moved or vocalized, and other impossible events that challenged everything medical science teaches about death and consciousness. "The most disturbing part," Dr. Chen continued, "is that no one investigates what these incidents might mean for our understanding of human consciousness, death, and the transition between life and non-life. Instead, the focus is always on protecting institutional reputation and maintaining the status quo." That conversation with Dr. Chen forced me to confront a terrible choice. I could continue my medical education, accept the official explanation for what I had witnessed, and become part of a system that prioritized reputation over truth, or I could maintain my integrity and face the consequences of challenging powerful institutions. I chose integrity, but the cost was devastating. I graduated from Stanford Medical School, but my residency applications were mysteriously rejected by every program I applied to. When I finally secured a position at a small community hospital in Oregon, I discovered that my reputation for unreliability had followed me. Attending physicians were hesitant to trust my clinical observations, and my career advancement was limited by persistent questions about my judgment. For 20 years, I practiced medicine while carrying the burden of what I had witnessed that night in the anatomy lab. Every time I pronounced a patient dead, every time I observed post-mortem procedures, I wondered about the mysteries that medical science refuses to acknowledge or investigate. The bleeding cadaver of Mrs. Thornfield taught me that death might not be the absolute, final state that we teach in medical school. But more importantly, it taught me that institutions will sacrifice truth and destroy careers to protect their version of reality. 3 weeks ago, I finally submitted my resignation from Riverside Medical Center. I could no longer practice medicine within a system that demands silence about phenomena that could revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness and mortality. Mrs. Thornfield's impossible night of bleeding remains, for me, the most significant medical phenomenon I have ever witnessed. It represents not just a challenge to our understanding of post-mortem physiology, but a profound indictment of how medical institutions handle inconvenient truths. I often wonder how many other medical students and physicians have witnessed similar impossible events, only to be silenced by institutional pressure and professional threats. How many breakthrough discoveries have been suppressed because they challenged established medical doctrine? The case of the bleeding cadaver will always remind me that medicine, for all its advances and sophistication, still contains profound mysteries that we are not brave enough to investigate. Until we develop the courage to examine these impossible phenomena openly and honestly, we will never truly understand the nature of consciousness, death, and what it means to be human. Some mysteries demand investigation, even when institutions prefer silence. Mrs. Thornfield's blood taught me that truth is more important than career, integrity more valuable than institutional approval, and that some questions are worth asking, regardless of the personal cost.